Hello, Alden Loury. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Glenn Lowry?
I am very fine indeed. This is Glenn Loury at the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, and I'm a professor at Brown University. And I happen to be talking with Alden Keith Loury, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Metropolitan Planning Council in the city of Chicago, and who, as it happens, is also my son. So welcome, welcome to the Glenn Show, my son.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on with you again.
All right, now, viewers of the Glenn Show out there who are about to accuse me of nepotism, what I want you to know is that I'm having this conversation with my son, of whom I'm quite proud, Alden Keith Loury. You see him right there. Not simply in order to favor my kin, but because Alden happens to be in the city of Chicago, running a research and evaluation shop at an important civic organization in that city, who's been addressing himself in his work to some of the sort of fundamental questions that are confronting urban America today. Chicago is a case in point. And so I thought him an ideal person to have a conversation with about the question of violence, homicide, and, quote, carnage, close quote, in the African American neighborhoods of the city of Chicago. We don't have to educate the audience about the general problem. Anybody who's got a internet connection or reads a newspaper or watches cable television knows it's been very much discussed in terms of these horrific cases of innocent people being killed as bystanders and drive-by shootings, this, that, and the other, high levels of violence in Chicago. But I thought that it might be really useful to get a sort of ground zero report about this problem. And as it happens, and I should let you speak for yourself, Alden, you've been looking into this in one way or another in your capacity as Director of Research and Evaluation at the Metropolitan Planning Council of Chicago. And I thought you would have some insights to share with us. So I'm really happy that you're willing to do so. So I have a few questions that I'd be really fascinated to hear your reactions to. The President of the United States has singled out the city of Chicago, perhaps in part because it's Barack Obama's adopted hometown and he can somehow embarrass the former president by calling attention to the high rates of violence there, but he singled it out as indicative of a fundamental problem of the lack of security and safety for the residents of African American communities in the big cities of the country. The discourse around this has become very highly politicized, and I'm wondering if you think that it's an appropriate characterization. I mean, is your city being picked on in some way? Are these problems being misstated in your view? The general question I'm trying to put to you is, how do you understand the public discussions that we're having? How do you understand the problem, and how do you understand the way in which it's being talked about, or perhaps inaccurately talked about? Again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what's your reaction to the general discourse that's going on around the problems in your city?
Well, I have a number of feelings. The first thing I'll say is that whether it's President Trump or anyone else, discussion about the level of violence in the city of Chicago, particularly in Chicago's African American neighborhoods, I think is definitely warranted. I think that President Trump is totally on to call out the issues that he's calling out. Now, the caveat, of course, is that I'm not sure of what his motivations are, and I'm sure the point maybe makes sense for him to do that. So I don't think that
Excuse me,
necessarily,
Alden.
at least from my understanding.
Excuse
I'm
me for
sorry.
interrupting. Would you just repeat what you just said, because we had a little technical glitch?
Oh, I was just saying that I think that given the level of the problem, whether it's President Trump or anyone else,
Yeah.
to call out how deep the issues of violence are in Chicago, and particularly in Chicago's African American neighborhoods, I think is definitely warranted. Now, I certainly believe that the president has very political motivations for doing so, and I'm also not all that confident about his sincerity about actually, in terms of how much he actually cares about what's happening here in Chicago. But it is a very deep problem, and it should be on the minds of every Chicagoan, particularly every Black Chicagoan, and anyone else from a public policy standpoint or from a political standpoint. There should be a lot of discussion about what's happening here, because what's happening here is dramatic. So I in some ways, I'm happy the president is talking about it, because it will force perhaps others to talk about it as well.
What is happening there from your ground level bird's eye view? What is happening?
Well, point blank, people are killing each other, particularly young people. Young Black people are killing, and young Black people are dying. I remember writing a piece maybe about 4 or 5 years ago talking about this, looking specifically at the number of young Black folks who were dying who were under the age of 30. And that was how I opened the piece: young people killing and young people dying. And I think that, in a nutshell, is what's happening here in Chicago. And then you can get into the numbers. But the fact that there are more homicides happening in Chicago than in both New York and LA combined, I think is an amazing statistic, and very illustrative of just how deep the problems are here. Now, with that being said, I live on the South Side. I live in a neighborhood called Auburn Gresham, which is just south of Inglewood and West Inglewood. Auburn Gresham is in one of the more violent parts of the city. And just for reference, in a 24-hour period just this past week, there was within 2 blocks of my home, there were 4 shooting incidents that left 3 people dead and 5 people wounded.
Oh my God.
And I would say that in the 11, 12 years that we've been staying there, that was probably the worst 24-hour period. But murders have happened in our close proximity several times during the time that we've been here. So
excuse me. I just have to ask you: are you afraid?
Am I afraid?
Yeah.
I'm concerned, but I wouldn't say that I'm afraid.
I mean, afraid for your children, my grandchildren, afraid for your lovely wife, my daughter-in-law.
I don't fear that there will be direct violence to me, but I will tell you this: the more and more these things happen, when I come home and I put my key in the door and I go in, I think to myself, am I doing the right thing by me and my family by being here? I think about that much more often today than I did when we first moved there, which this is a neighborhood that I grew up in. So there was a lot of nostalgia and kind of moving back to the old neighborhood. I felt a lot of pride in doing that. I feel pride in saying that I've been there for 12 years, even with all of the problems going on. And to some degree, I feel proud to say that I live there, because of some of the things that are happening there. But yeah, I'd be lying if I said that I don't think about it often, and I don't question myself often about whether, I'm doing the right thing by still being there. But I don't fear walking outside, and maybe this is crazy, but I don't fear walking outside and being shot or being accosted. If I did, I think I would have responded by now. But I don't have a direct fear. But like I said, I'm concerned, and my head's on a swivel. And I walk out the door, and I know that things are happening around me, and so I'm trying to be conscientious. I, make sure that my wife and my girls are also thinking about, knowing when to avoid trouble, knowing when to not be out on the street, things of that nature. It's being here and being in on the South Side, you can't escape the reality of it. But I will also say that it is not a life of terror, despite the headlines that we hear. The block that I live on is a very stable block. The thing that I think is very interesting about Chicago, and it was part of the analysis that I did recently, looking at where homicides occur, you can be literally, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, and to some degree it's a city of blocks. There's a block just east of us where there was one murder that happened maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. There's some rental property there. There's some bad actors on that block. On the block that I live on, it's all single family homes, and most of the people on that block are people who are the descendants, or they are the folks themselves who moved to this block
Yeah.
40, 50 years ago
Yeah.
as the first African Americans to inhabit that block. And so there's a lot of stability and longevity, and I think that plays a part in why the block that I'm on is a relatively stable block. Now, with that being said, there are a couple of houses across the street from me where there are some interesting things happening in terms of narcotics, in terms of wild parties and things of that nature. But for the most part, those folks are relatively tame, and we don't have a lot of.
Well, okay. You don't have to be, it seems to me, living next door to somebody who's firing out the window to be standing on a bus stop at the corner, or just happen to be in a playground somewhere where something is going down. That's really quite dangerous. Some of these cases I've been reading about in the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune are just that: wrong place, wrong time. Unfortunately, child, promising teenager, or whatever, ends up dead. So it is sobering and I must say, to me, profoundly disturbing to think that, my son and his family are holding on. I mean, I can't imagine what the conflict is that you're dealing with in terms of a sense of loyalty and duty. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah.
On the one hand, and self-preservation on the other. Nobody should have to make those choices.
No, when I hear people say that they have left the neighborhood, I don't feel as though they are betraying any loyalty or duty in any way. I totally understand, because I've 1,000 times in my mind said, I got to get out of here. We've got to leave. And, I guess I just haven't had a close enough experience, or I haven't been kind of dismayed enough in what I've seen to say, okay, it's time for us to go. But particularly after that 24-hour period, my wife and I talked some, and I think that day is coming. It just hasn't gotten here yet, but I do see a future where we will probably decide to relocate. So,
okay. Now, this is a bit of a side point, but you mentioned in passing that you're proud to be there in part because you're sticking it out, but also in part because some of the positive stuff that's going on there. I think I heard you say that.
Yeah.
I want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about the positive stuff that's going on that you're proud of in this neighborhood that's been so demonized in the national press as, ground zero killing fields, et cetera, Chirac, et cetera.
Yeah, it is a community of very strong and resilient and prideful people. And on some level, I think, there is a great deal of very strong kind of community-focused actions that are going on. From the things that the Block Club does to, the events that happen at, we're not far from Michael Pfleger's St. Sabina Church and church community, which has been in the national press from time to time. And so, Pfleger will have very prominent African-American speakers, Cornel West, folks who were heavily involved in the civil rights movement have spoken at his church. A lot of cultural activities that take place there. And so Alexis was actually a student at Sabina's preschool for 2 years.
That's and your so daughter, Alexis, for the benefit of the audience.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, who's 13 now, so this is some years ago. But when she was attending school there, we were very much a part of the Sabina community and attended a number of events there. So, so there's, for all of the things that are going wrong, there is a lot that's going right. There are a lot of very dedicated people. And so in some ways, I feel good being there. This is where I grew up. This is In some ways, I feel like the story of the neighborhood is similar to my story, and I feel very connected to it. Even with the times walking out and seeing the street memorials, there are also times when I walk out and I see families playing in their front yard. I see graduation parties taking place. I see people sending their kids off to prom. I see life the way I think you would expect to see it anywhere else. That kind of life happens here also. It's just that there are also a number of issues that people are having internally, personally, and then on a community-wide basis as well. And that's where I think the problems stem from.
Okay.
But there's still a lot to like and to be proud of.
I think it's very important to put that on the record. Tell us then, my son, how you are understanding these foundational issues that you think underlie the violence that's happening in these neighborhoods in Chicago.
Well, it's multifaceted, and I would say, if we look at it on some levels, there are certainly very kind of personal challenges that people are dealing with. There are family struggles that people have, things that are happening in the household, and then there are community struggles, that I think all kind of play a part in what's going on here. So even if we were to address some of the community issues and the things that were more in line with what I kind of wrote about, where I talked about the lack of investment, I talked about the level of poverty, I talked about the lack of jobs, things like that. That's certainly under education. Those at that scale. But then you also have individual things that are happening within the home that are happening perhaps on a very personal basis, on an individual basis, whether those are struggles dealing with drug addiction, whether those are struggles dealing with a lack of self-worth, whether those are struggles dealing with mental health issues, a whole host of issues. And I think that the community-wide problems and the lack of investment and things of that nature kind of exacerbate those personal problems because there's a lack of resources to some degree. People aren't able perhaps to get the kind of help that they need. And then in the middle of that, you have struggles with families where, particularly I think is the impact on young people, and they come up in households where there just isn't a lot of positive action going on. And, those young people are really influenced by that in terms of what they can expect from themselves, what they can expect from the world, and they kind of head down a path where it's really not very healthy for them. And until they're shown the way by a mentor, by maybe success in school, success in athletics, or success in some other arena, they just kind of continue down the path of which they are familiar based on relatives, friends, neighbors, so on and so forth. And so I think you've got that happening as well. And as young people coming up, they just think, hey, this is what life is supposed to be. And unless they're exposed to something else, they kind of stay on that track, and the tragedies continue.
Okay. Trying to summarize very briefly the distinction between what you're calling lack of investment, quote unquote, on the one hand, and what I hear you calling internal problems within families on the other. Say a little bit more, and I know you've done this study under the auspices of the Metropolitan Planning Council of Chicago about the, quote, investment problem, close quote.
Yeah, so I looked at 4 factors. I looked at, for each census tract in Chicago, I looked at the percentage of households that were earning 6-figure incomes. That was my proxy for investment. If you have wealthy households, generally speaking, you're going to see investment in those areas. I also looked at the poverty rate, the level of bachelor's degree attainment, and unemployment. And I looked at the citywide figures for those 4 indicators. And for census tracts that had less than half the quote-unquote positive indicators, being the percentage of 6-figure households, being the percentage of adults with bachelor's degrees, I gave a flag to each census tract that had less than half the citywide mark. For the negative indicators, rate and unemployment, for census tracts that had a rate that was 50% higher than the citywide mark. I gave those census tracts flags as well. So Chicago's 801 census tracts could have from no flags, meaning they were doing very well on those four indicators: low poverty, low unemployment, high six-figure households, high bachelor's degree attainment, or four flags, meaning they had the opposite. They had low education, low six-figure households, high poverty, high unemployment. And I looked at the murder rate for those 4 or 5 from 0 to 4 types of census tracts. The census tracts that had no flags in Chicago had a murder rate just under 10. It was around 9 point something. I don't know.
10 per
100,000 residents.
Okay, that's very low.
And I'm taking a peek at it. Per 100,000 residents. The census that had 4 flags, the murder rate was 87 per 100,000. So it was roughly 9 times higher. And with each flag, the rate increased dramatically. And so I didn't think it was surprising at all that where you found the homicides, you'd find these kinds of characteristics. What I found interesting was the fact that as you added more of these characteristics, the rate seemed to really kind of ramp up. And that got me wondering about these things in some ways kind of compounding one another. Again, this was not some kind of empirical multivariate regression analysis or anything like that. It was very simple. Now, what I will say is that I did do correlations, and I picked these 4 factors because the correlations to homicides, homicide rate was relatively strong, around 4, around 0.4, a little bit more in some cases, a little bit less in a couple of other cases. And I said to myself, well, let's see what happens when we throw these factors on top of one another. And I calculated the rate when we did and got the analysis that we came up with. So I think there's something there. Now, granted, there are a whole host of other factors, and just in our run-up to this, I talked about there are things that are happening on a personal level, things that are happening on a family or household level that are also contributing to this. But when we look at these broad factors, I think there's that's a part of the story. And in terms of trying to address these issues, particularly around violence, we have to have at least part of the conversation that talks about these kinds of things, in addition to talking about what people need to do on a personal level. So,
okay, let me see if I got this. 801 census tracts in Chicago. 4 factors characteristic of the well-being, level of investment, sort of economic standing of these census tracts. High poverty, high unemployment is not a good thing. Low income in the households, low education is not a good thing. Census tracts in Chicago that have low unemployment, low poverty relative to the rest of the city, high household income in terms of proportion over 100,000, and high education in terms of bachelor's degree, very little homicide. Census tracts where you have a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment, low educational attainment, and low household incomes, a lot of violence. You note that as more of these factors in the negative accumulate, the level of the violence observed in those census tracts escalates. And this leads you to conclude that at least one important part of the picture of violence in Chicago is related to disadvantage, lack of opportunity, high unemployment, high poverty, and low income in education.
Yes.
Okay, now, and I must tread carefully here, because this is my son, and he's a director of research and evaluation at the Metropolitan Planning Council of Chicago, and I'm very proud of him. But I'm the Merton Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences at Brown University, and the first thing the seminar participants, I'm talking about my colleagues, these people occupying offices down the hall here, are going to say, if a young scholar like yourself were to walk in with this account, is, you're telling us all this because you mean for us to believe that the low economic conditions, the high unemployment, and the lack of college education are the causes of the violence. And by implication, that if social policy were to reverse those low indicators, if more jobs were being provided, if greater education were somehow to be underwritten and so forth, we wouldn't be seeing the violence. But correlation, let me just finish the complaint.
Okay.
Okay. correlation is not causation. Policy intervention relies upon a presumption of causation. Who can be surprised that a census tract where there's a lot of violence will also be a census tract where people who have $100,000 of household income are not living? They're not living there because they have a choice about where to live. So the observation that there are relatively few college graduate, $100,000 a year households in the census tracts where there are violence in no way establishes the claim, the implicit claim, that were somehow we to increase the level of education or the level of income of people, we wouldn't be seeing the violence there. It might be correlation without it being causation, but the policy, the implicit policy recommendation coming from your report relies upon it being causation. Okay, so that's the complaint. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would first clarify by saying that the analysis isn't. I guess I can't say that it doesn't mean to imply that there is a very close association in the relationship. It certainly is implying that. I wouldn't go as far as to say is that it causes that. But the second half of that, in terms of the policy intervention, I would stand very firmly on the belief that if we were to improve the job opportunities, if we were to improve the quality of education, if we were to figure out ways to diminish the level of poverty, and if we were able to increase the number of the investment, and like I said, the six-figure households was a proxy for investment. If we were to invest more in these communities in terms of the physical structures that are in the community, in terms of the commercial options that were there, that we would see better outcomes, and not just in terms of homicides, but in other areas. I do, and the analysis to me just kind of was another building block on that firm belief. As someone who's lived here in Chicago and lived in these communities, I spent a fair number of years living in public housing as a young child, and then onto the South Side from there. I firmly believe that those are the kind of building blocks to the violence, and that if we can address those issues, that we would see remedies in terms of the violence. Now, does that mean that it causes the violence? I can't say. And one other thing that I will say is that in terms of the years that I've just been studying violence here in Chicago.
Studying. We don't have to use scare quotes. I didn't mean to put you in a box like that. I just meant to raise a question. That's all.
But I know who I'm talking to here. So, the thing I will say is that crime and violence, I think, are, if not the most challenging area of social science and public policy to deal with. Someone has to tell me what might be more difficult. It is an incredible challenge to determine exactly what leads people to produce the kinds of numbers that we're seeing. I'm taking my best guess based on research that I've done over the years and based on anecdotal information from people that I've talked to who've been victims of violence, who have committed acts of violence, who've spent time in prison, conversations that I've had with them as a journalist, and then my observations as a lifelong Chicagoan. It leads me to believe that, yes, indeed, these things are a part of the problem and can also be a part of the solution if we were able to reverse the trends that I highlighted in the piece.
Okay, very good. Now, I'm going to call it pushback, but I'm not at all unsympathetic to what you're saying, and I especially appreciate your observation that these are very, very difficult problems to get to the bottom of, and even real scholars like myself have a very hard time definitively identifying what's going on in terms of causality. But I want to push back a little bit. Of course, investment in human beings in disadvantaged communities is worth undertaking regardless of whether or not we can confidently predict that the consequence of that investment would be to remedy this or that problem, including the problem of homicidal violence. Of course, unemployment should be lowered. Jobs should be made available to the extent that policy can do that in the interest of promoting human flourishing, including the flourishing of human beings in the most disadvantaged quarters of our society. Of course, investments in education ought to be undertaken and so forth. Okay. On the other hand, a sociologist might argue that when we try to look at the fine structure of the violence that's going on, we're really only talking about a few thousand at the most individuals, and maybe even hundreds of individuals whose behavior is generating the problem that we identify. We're talking about gangs. We're talking about kids with guns. We're talking about individuals involved in the drug trade, and so on and so forth. And unless their behavior is somehow constrained, whether it's by law enforcement or by some other social intervention that gets to the hearts and minds of people and causes them to look differently at the way in which they're resolving their conflicts and disputes, the way in which they're living their lives, unless that behavior is changed, we can talk until the cows come home about these big macro socioeconomic factors, and we will not stop the killing. We have to get the guns out of the hands of the people who are killing, and we have to get the people who are doing the killing to either behave differently or not be on the streets where they can kill people, a person might say. So I'm wondering how you would respond to that, not unsympathetic to the broader social policy program of elevating the living conditions of people, but sort of hard-headed about, who's actually doing the violence and who do we have to deal with in order to get it stopped.
Yeah, I think and I certainly can appreciate that opinion. The thing that I hear when I hear that approach is that on some level, the people that we're talking about who are committing the violence in Chicago and other places are in some ways fundamentally flawed. Like, these are people who are violent people, and that what's happening around them in terms of the socioeconomic conditions and so on and so forth doesn't have as much of an impact on their behavior than something internal within them that causes them to be like this. And it is I believe correct that it is a small percentage of people that are responsible for the homicides, and to that degree, I can understand why the mayor and the police superintendent here want to push for longer mandatory minimums for repeat gun offenders.
Yeah.
The thing that I would push back on a little bit is that when you actually look at these individuals and consider that the lives that they're leading, I think that the lives that they're leading and the philosophies that they've developed are shaped dramatically by what they see around them, what they see within their own home, what they see within their communities. And that's not to say that everybody who was in their shoes is affected the same way. I often think about Michael Eric Dyson, who has a brother who served time in prison, and of course Michael Eric Dyson, went a completely different way. That happens all the time, particularly in black households. We are, and in these neighborhoods where all this violence is happening, there's also kids who are graduating from high school at the top of their class, going off to college and doing extremely well.
Right.
So there is something happening individually in terms of how they respond to kind of the social stimuli that's happening around them. But I do think that the utter hopelessness in some respects that people sense and feel in their communities does impact them. The violence that they see does impact them. In addition to the environmental factors in terms of drug abuse, or fetal alcohol syndrome, and other things like that, they're affected and impacted by that as well. And I think that's something that shouldn't be forgotten in terms of thinking about what's happening with people. And so if our resources aren't addressing those kinds of problems, I think it's a bit short-sighted to say, well, we got to lock these people up in order to make this problem go away. There's a reason why people are behaving the way they're behaving that could be addressed in other ways, through investment, through job opportunities, so on and so forth.
Why do I have to choose? Excuse me. Why does it have to be either I have longer mandatory minimums for repeat gun offenders to make sure that these few thousand of individuals who are wreaking havoc are not on the street, or I invest in education and the human development of vast swaths of America, which is at the margins and deserves a better shot. Why do I have to choose between those two? And moreover, let me just finish. Why does it have to imply demonization of black people in general, or black individuals in particular? They're horrific, they're monsters, there's something wrong about them, whatever, to recognize that the behavior of individuals, not necessarily intrinsically bad people, but factually bad actors, is causing such costs for the rest of the society. Why can't I have a more nuanced discourse in which at one and the same time, and I'll stop, I'm tough on people who do stuff that makes life miserable for others around them, but I'm also generous and broad-minded in the way in which I view the communities from which those people come.
Well, let's keep in mind something here in terms of when we're talking about repeat gun offenders. We're talking about gun offenders. We're not talking about murderers. Now, I'm not saying that there are probably some murderers within those gun offenders. I'm not naive enough to say that. But what I'm saying is that we're punishing people for illegally possessing a gun, and we're sending them away for as many as a 7-year minimum. And what I'm saying is that I certainly believe there is a better public policy response to the violence than sending someone who illegally possesses a gun, sending them away for 7 years, especially if the person who is illegally possessing the gun is an 18-year-old kid who lives in a neighborhood like where I live. Now, as a 47-year-old man, I don't have the pressures that an 18-year-old kid would have to deal with, because when I walk down the street, the hoodlums and thugs and everybody else, they're not necessarily worried about me. But if they see an 18-year-old kid who looks like me, they're going to be wondering, okay, well, who is that guy? I don't recognize him. You don't recognize him. Is he rolling with another set? Is he coming here to do harm to me? Is he trying to take over our corner? Whatever the case might be. So I'm a target as an 18-year-old black man on the south side of Chicago. And if I don't have a gun, in some respects, I'm like a fawn, just waiting to be slaughtered. And so there are a lot of young people in Chicago, a lot of young black men in Chicago who own a gun illegally because they feel like they have to. And so a number of those kinds of people who never want necessarily to go out and rob or steal or kill anybody, but they own a gun because they feel like they have to. A lot of those guys are going to get swept up in a 7-year minimum if that's the policy that we go to. And so I'm just saying that I'm not saying that there aren't instances when we need to lock people up because they've done wrong. They've committed an act where we've said this person is clearly a threat to public safety. If on a land of gun ownership, the Second Amendment right, and we're going to lock people up for 7 years because they're exercising that right illegally?
Well, that last bit was very important. The last bit was very important. The Second Amendment does not give you a license to violate the law about the licensing and the possession of firearms. But I take the point. I think the point is very important, and it has to be acknowledged. Kids are holding these illegal weapons because they can't get weapons legally, and they need weapons to defend themselves or protect themselves, or at least they feel that they do. And not all of those kids are murderers, so they shouldn't all be treated 7-year minimum. But it's repeat offender. But still, that is harsh. I wish I knew the numbers. I wish I knew the proportion of quote unquote innocent young men who are going to get swept up relative to the proportion of gang members and so forth.
And we have to think about this. And this is just an anecdote, but we have to think about how the law is actually exercised here or enforced here.
Okay.
Cops raid an apartment. They find 4 young black men in the apartment. This is an actual case I remember hearing about. 2 of them are upstairs in the house. I should say they raided the house. 2 of them are upstairs in the house playing video games. One is a neighbor who's come over to play. 2 other kids are downstairs. The cops raid the place. They find a gun tucked between the sheets or between the mattress and the box spring in one bedroom.
Yeah.
They arrest everybody in the house for illegal gun possession.
Yeah.
And so if that's the way we're going to to enforce the law. And again, that's one case. But if that's the way we're going to enforce the law, I just think we have to be very careful about how much time we want to give people. Now, one, that should probably not be the way we enforce the law. It certainly shouldn't be the way we enforce the law. But I just think we have to be very careful. And the other point I was going to make is that what happens after that 7-year minimum? What happens to those people, whether they're raging, homicidal maniacs, or they're people who are just kind of caught up in the sting? What happens to them? I would say that if you lock them up for 7 years, a young black kid, 24, 25, 30 years old, he served 7 years in prison for anything.
I got it, man. I got it.
Yeah.
You've ruined his life. I mean, you've made a monster if you didn't start with one. You could even say, although we don't want to use that kind of language because it's demonizing, but and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it could be very bad social policy to use prison as a remedy for a kid that gets caught up in something like that. And 7 years is a long time.
Yes.
Okay.
Very long time.
All right. In what time we have remaining, I want to ask you a little bit about the question of how we Americans are talking about this problem and what your concerns might be about that. Let me just preface this by noting, if I recall this correctly, that the mayor of the city, Rahm Emanuel, at some point floated a trial balloon that he wanted to give a speech addressing the source of this violence problem that derives from what's going on inside the households and the families where some of the young men who are caught up in it are residing, the absence of fathers there, or the failure of parenting to provide the right kind of structure and discipline. And so, do you know where your kid is at 1 o'clock in the morning, blah, blah, blah. And that trial balloon got shot down pretty quickly by some influential voices in the African-American community and elsewhere in Chicago who said, how dare you, Mayor Emanuel, deign to address yourself to the issue of, the conditions inside of the households of low-income African-Americans in this city. I don't see you talking about other communities in that way. It's not your place to do so. So was that, if I describe that correctly, was that the right response to Emanuel? And more generally, if not he, then who can or should, and how can or should these people talk about parental responsibility, about family structure, about absent fathers, about neglectful parents, and so forth and so on? How do we talk about it? Or do we talk about it?
Sure. So should there be a conversation? I would say yes. Is it the most important conversation to have? I would say I think the most important conversation to have is about the broader issues. But it is an important conversation to have, yes. Rahm Emanuel shouldn't be anywhere near that conversation.
Please elaborate.
So here's the interesting thing. So one very interesting news story that came out, this was a few years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, I can't remember exactly, but there was some incident where Rahm Emanuel's teenage son, and I don't know if this was his oldest or because I think he's got 3 kids, I'm not sure where they are, but one of his teenage sons was either assaulted or something happened to him late at night, not far from the home. I don't know if it was right in front of the home or within a block or two. There was a wild speculation about what he was doing outside at that time of night. And so I could see somebody saying very clearly to the mayor, like, well, how you going to tell me how to raise my kids? Okay. And so I would say that, and for anybody who wants to have a conversation with anybody else about parenting, and as a parent of 3, it's perhaps the hardest job that any adult is ever going to have. Yep. And I think it's a harder job when you're living in some of the communities that we're talking about than if you're living in a community that's well-resourced. But even in a well-resourced community, it's hard being a parent. And so I think that anybody who wants to have a conversation with anybody else about parenting needs to check themselves at the door. about how good of a parent they're being. Nobody's a perfect parent. Every parent has made all kinds of mistakes and problems. And so I just think that when you're parenting in a very tough situation, the mistakes and problems can lead to greater consequences. And for that reason, I do think that there needs to be a conversation. But there should be nobody standing at the lectern saying, this is how you should parent. Nah.
I hear you, my son. but look here. Let me just ask you, and let me ask you directly. How ought the African American community, our leadership, our intellectual, public intellectual, our journalists, academics, politicians, and whatnot, be addressing one another about this problem? Or should we, if Rahm Emanuel should stay 1,000 miles away from this kind of conversation, and if anybody about to give a lecture about parenting ought to check themselves, and I'll grant both points for the sake of this argument, does there not still remain some role for a kind of moral leadership which exhorts people in the interest of their duties, whether it be their Christian duty or their duties as just decent human beings, to attend to the upbringing of their children in such a way as to minimize the likelihood that their kids get caught up in this mess?
Well, that like I said, that conversation needs to happen. It needs to lose the whole kind of paternalistic framing. Society's problems are because you're not taking care of your kids. We need to lose any type of conversation or language or anything that makes people feel that way. But the thing I will say is that one of the most insightful things I've heard about this particular issue came from a guy named Philip Jackson, who runs a nonprofit called the Black Star Project here in Chicago. And several years ago, I remember interviewing Phil for a small piece I was writing. And he said, our parents need support. And it's not to say they need to be chided. He said they need support. Our parents, in many of these communities, and there was a very small portion of my recent piece where I talked about the 18 to 34 age bracket being the one that's in terms of investment, employment, so on and so forth. These are your parents, and in some cases, in that 30-year spectrum, are even your grandparents.
Yeah.
But these are the people who are the leaders of families. And if these folks have unemployment rates in the communities that had these four factors, the unemployment rate for the 18 to 34 bracket was nearly 40%. Dad, 40% unemployment.
I hear you.
So how can a community function well? How can children be parented well if their parents themselves are struggling with life? Parenting is hard enough if you're a millionaire. If you've got all of these personal challenges in your life, then parenting is going to be that much more difficult. And so that's why I say if we can address the other issues that are happening in the lives of these folks, it's funny, when a kid gets killed, and this is like stereotype, but a kid gets killed and the mom is crying and weeping and saying, well, my son wasn't in the gang and he was a good kid.
Yeah.
And people look at that and go, okay, yeah, look, the guy's he's been arrested 20 times and he's so on and so forth. But in reality, that kid is that mother's baby.
Yeah.
And to her, he was just this wonderful, fun-loving kid. She doesn't no longer become a loving mother because her kid, was being a knucklehead and maybe was doing things that he wasn't supposed to do. She doesn't no longer become a loving mother because she herself has perhaps not been the kind of parent that she should have been or could have been. These are still real people and human people, and she could be a better parent if she had better circumstances. If she wasn't worried about, are they going to have a roof over their head for the next 2 months? They've been couch surfing or she's out of work or she's dealing with some other kinds of issues. She could more focus on what's happening with her kids. She could maybe be more involved, more attuned, and be more aware of what's happening. You know what? Okay, He's been coming in late. He's been running with the wrong crowd. I need to say something to him. But if she's got a million and one other things going on in her brain, how can she do that? Certainly, if she's the only person who's involved in the kid's life, that's certainly a factor as well. And that it should be part of the conversation. It should be noted that because a man and a woman aren't married, or because a man and a woman aren't in the same household, doesn't mean that a man and a woman aren't being parents. And all you have to do is walk around Auburn Gresham or many other neighborhoods on the south side, and you'll see a lot of guys with their kids walking in the park, going to school, going to the grocery store, doing stuff. Black men, I think, have been demonized because they don't fit the American, in many cases, they don't fit the American narrative about who should be, what a family unit looks like. African Americans are, by the statistics, the most often divorced, and certainly the most often involved in unwed parenting situations. But black men are far more involved in their lives than those numbers might suggest. If you believe that a man is not involved with his family because he's not married to the mother or he's not living with the family, you're making a very severe miscalculation, particularly with regard to African Americans. So I want to make that point as well. But yeah, so there should be a conversation about parenting, but it should be about what are the things to help the parents live better lives, as opposed to what are the things that the parents need to know in order to be better parents. I don't know what to tell a mom who's got a 16-year-old kid who's thugging and dealing drugs. I don't know what to tell her about how she's failed as being a parent. I don't think she's failed in some respects. I don't think she's failed at all. If your kid is doing that, there's some issues going on, and sometimes those issues happen regardless of how involved you've been as a parent. I mean, the most difficult, or the biggest lesson I've learned as being a parent is that they're people. They're independent people with their own thoughts, their own ambitions, whatever. And I can steer them and guide them. But on some level, they're going to choose the path that they want to go. And then I have to be there to help them, to help break the fall, or to help try to steer them slightly until I can get them to listen. But sometimes I'm going to lose in those battles. And even in these neighborhoods, given all of the environmental factors that are going around, given all of the mental health challenges and other issues like that, sometimes people are just going to make very bad choices. And so my hope is that we can understand that if we help people understand that they have better choices, if we can give them and put them in situations where they can make better choices, we can help the parents of those young people be in better positions that they can actually be more involved, then maybe we'll get some better outcomes. I don't think it's going to happen by locking more people up. I don't think it's going to happen by having Rahm Emanuel or somebody else saying, you know what, when my kid was dealing drugs, this is what I said to him. You know,
I don't think Rahm Emanuel's going to be caught dead saying that.
Conversation. But and I'd say that in jest.
Yeah, I know.
But so anyhow, that's my thought process.
Okay, well, I think we should probably call it a conversation, Alden. I can't thank you enough. Your perspective is very important, and I'm, as a parent, enormously proud that that you're doing the work that you're doing. I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. That's the subject of another conversation. But much love, my son, and keep up the good work.
Dad, thanks so much. I appreciate it. It means the world to me to hear you say that. And this is always fun. So don't ever be shy about inviting me. I love doing this.
I won't be. We'll do it again.
Great.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Much love. Thank you.